STEAM Exchange for 2014. So we're very excited that you all were able to brave a little bit of the cold out there and come on in and join us for some conversation, some learning, and some pizza. That just sounds completely attractive, right? But the purpose of the STEAM Exchange, just to give you a little bit of background, is it originates with the idea of a salon, in that you bring together intellectuals, either ones who get paid to do it or those who do it for free, to come together and share ideas in a casual and a intellectually rigorous environment. And so we wanted to set up a STEAM Exchange, the first one for this year, because we figured it'd be pretty cold outside, and do it on climate change. And we're not just simply talking about sort of geo-weather or meteorological climate change, but we're talking about all different types of spaces where there could be some form of climate there, and how that is changing, the impacts that we have on that, and the impacts of the environment on us. Okay? And so we've got three amazing speakers that we are really glad to have participate in our first STEAM Exchange. I think it's a great way to start off this year. We have Lonnie Thompson, who's a distinguished professor of the School of Earth Sciences and Bird Polar Research Center research scientist, who will be speaking as well. Sam White, an assistant professor of environmental history in the Department of History, and Sathya Gopalakrishnan, who's an assistant professor in the Department of Agriculture, Environmental, and Developmental Economics. And Sathya will be starting us off, and the title of her talk is Shifting Shorelines, Coupling Economics and Geomorphology to Adapt to Climate Change. Oh, what's up?
Is it possible to turn off the circular lights?
That doesn't do it. I think it's something back here. We'll just play with the switches for a little while. Oh, just to let everyone know, what we do is the speakers have been given about 20 minutes to talk, and then 10 minutes at the end of that to be able to take questions. And so the idea is that they can do whatever they want. This is a suggested way they should handle their time. They can do whatever they want with that 30-minute block, essentially. And I will remind them at about the 15-minute mark that they've got 5 more minutes left. And then after that, they start eating into that time in which you can have some dialogue with them. And so you all are more than welcome to start, stamping your feet and maybe throwing, pizza rinds at them. And so at the end of each talk, we will take a break for people to just get up, walk around, to socialize, to talk a little bit about whatever the topic was, and then I'll bring everyone back together for the next talk. All right, that's Sathya.
Great. Thank you. Thanks a lot for inviting me to talk here, and I feel extremely privileged to be talking with Sam and Lonnie. And keeping with this theme idea of interdisciplinary work, I thought it might be fitting to talk about work that actually couples two different disciplines in identifying how we can adapt to climate change. So when we say climate change, you're all thinking storms, sea level rise. These are the words that really come to your mind when you say what is going on, what is happening when you say climate change. If you were to pick up a newspaper, a local newspaper in any coastal town, these are some of the things that we're going to read, be it North Carolina in the US, Australia, England, or India. Coastal towns are worldwide facing a threat from retreating shorelines. The systematic landward movement of the shoreline is causing a concern for coastal communities worldwide. In the US alone, it's estimated that approximately 90% of the sandy beaches along the US coastline are facing moderate to severe erosion. This is a picture of the North Carolina Cape Hatteras Lighthouse, which is now on rails so that it can keep being pushed back every time it goes into the water. And when it was originally built, it was 1,500 feet inland. So that's the rate at which shorelines have been retreating in the US. So the motivating question behind all this is, rapidly changing storm patterns and growing rates of sea level rise are essentially causing the shoreline or the coastline to move and mostly creating erosion in several parts of the shoreline and some accretion. And so the motivating question for us is, how do these drivers of sea level rise and storm patterns how does the coastline respond to these drivers or the impacts of climate change? But would we really be even considering this question if people did not live on the coast, right? In the past 3 decades, in the US, approximately, say, 10% of the US population is now moving to living closer to the coast, and it's that tension between growing coastal population or growing coastal development and eroding shorelines that leads to the need for policy intervention or some way to protect coastlines or stabilize the shoreline from continuing to threaten coastal economies that thrive primarily on tourism. Right? So we have one such policy which is dominant along the Atlantic coast in the US and several parts of the world is this idea of beach nourishment, euphemistically called nourishment, but it's essentially engineering. So you put sand on the beach as your shoreline is retreating. You take a bunch of sand either from deep sea or from some inlet and you dump it back onto the beach and build out the beach periodically. As it keeps eroding, you keep building it out. And this is considered a better policy than building a seawall or hard construction because that has significant other effects along other portions of the coast, right? So how it works, if you have an eroding beach, this is a house on Wrightsville Beach, North Carolina, right before a nourishment project, and this is that same house right after. So immediately you have a wide beach placed in front of your house or along the coast to build out the beach so that you can protect the front row homes. And this is being done a lot in the US and several other parts of the world. But what this does mean is that you can keep putting sand on the beach, it's going to keep retreating, and you're going to have to keep doing it over and over again. Not only is it going to keep retreating, it's going to retreat faster. The sediment that you're placing on the sand is not of the same quality or the same texture or the same characteristics as that natural shoreline, and it's going to have a tendency to want to go back to its original position, and that happens even faster, and so we've got to keep doing this over and over again. So yes, it's sea level rise and tropical storms or gradients in the longshore transport of sand is causing erosion, but humans are responding by changing or stabilizing the shoreline in order to protect coastal property and infrastructure, and this policy response then feeds back into what happens to the coastal dynamics itself, making the coastal system a tightly coupled economic coastal system. And as we face more and more the impacts of climate change, this coupling is far more enhanced and becomes stronger and stronger with growing rates of sea level rise. So what I hope to convince you is that you cannot understand the system by just studying the economics or why policy or how to manage it by knowing where the dollars come from, or by knowing only what's going on with waves and shorelines. You've got to really be able to understand the system as it is coupled with the human and natural dimensions. So why do I care as an economist? Because you have these coastal real estate markets that respond directly to changes in the coastal environment or the physical system. As your shorelines are retreating, beaches are becoming narrower, property values along the coast are drastically dropping, and so we have this market system that is responding or capitalizing some of the value of having these wider beaches. And beaches provide us with a variety of amenities, recreation, storm protection, and so if we know what their value is, we also want to know how to protect them and how to manage these resources, right? So we're interested in how to value coastal amenities when we know that there are these feedbacks. So one question is, how do we put a value on coastal amenities when we know that there are these feedbacks, human feedbacks, and once we know that there's a value, how can we figure out how to optimally manage our coasts, right? And so this is your environmental economics lesson for the day. Property markets have the ability to capitalize some of the value. So when we're thinking about environmental attributes, environmental amenities, it could be air quality, open space, beaches, proximity to water, and so on. those values are capitalized by the property markets that are close to where the amenity is. So we can think of houses, real estate, property, as being a bundle of attributes, and you're paying for these different attributes. You pay more if your house, if there are more rooms in the house, you pay more if it's a larger house. You could pay more if it's a newer house, or sometimes if it has some antique value, it could be more if it's an older house. So you pay for structural attributes of what services that house provides. You're also paying for things like neighborhood quality, right? A house in Upper Arlington is more expensive than a house in Columbus because there are amenities associated with the neighborhood that you purchase your property in. And then there are a bunch of environmental attributes that also contribute to the value of the house. So if we have data on real estate markets and sale prices, we can then decompose the value of that house into its various attributes and then figure out how much more would this be worth if there were better or more environmental amenities. Now this is then you can easily do this using statistics, run a regression, and then calculate what would be the incremental value, how much more would this house be worth if the beach were just a little bit wider. What makes this complicated is the feedback that I talked about, right? So yeah, property values depend on beach width or depend on how wide your beach is, how nice your beach is, and so on. But if you could nourish your beach and you could actually build out the beach and humans can influence how wide or how narrow the beach is, where are you most likely to go and do that? You're most likely to put a project or put some more sand in places that are already wealthy or that already have higher property values that you don't want to lose. So, beach width affects the value of the property, but that value in turn determines how much nourishment is going to happen and what the width of the beach will be. And so there's this simultaneity that we have to deal with in trying to get at what an accurate value could be, or how we can determine the value of environmental amenities that are capitalized. Thankfully, there are ways in economics, and without going into the gory details, there are statistical methods to deal with these kind of endogeneity or simultaneity problems. And so we're able to exploit the geomorphic or geological characteristics of the coastal system to isolate the value of beach width in how it affects the real estate market. So I had data from 10 different beaches in North Carolina, and I combined that with a bunch of attributes on what the physical characteristics of the beach is, whether it was a shelly beach, whether they had some kind of sandbag on the beach, and so on and so forth, to then be able to get at the value addition from beach width to the coastal real estate market when you account for this kind of a nourishment feedback, when people are doing something to the beach and when we're accounting for that feedback. And what I found was that there could be pretty much an order of magnitude difference in how sensitive property values are when you account for these feedbacks. What I have here is just the average for an average property in my data set, and the blue bars are for Wright's Beach, which has some of the highest property values in North Carolina. So a 1 foot addition to the beach, if the beach were 1 foot wider, it could potentially increase property values by close to $10,000 as opposed to $1,000, which is what a lot of the previous literature had said. So accounting for this coupled feedback really is important to determine, to get at the right value, and we need what those values are essential to determine what the optimal policy would be, right? So once we know how we can think of attaching some dollar value to beach management, we can then go ahead and ask the question, how often should you be doing this if you were optimally managing the coastline? So you have a beach that is systematically retreating, you put sand, it's going to go up, it's going to keep retreating again, you dump more sand, it's going to increase, and it's going to keep happening over and over again. Associated with this, you have some dollar values that you can get from the exercise that I just showed, and we value the present more than the future, so those values are going to keep lowering until, in the distant future you don't care much. And then that will then tell you how much it's going to cost to add more sand, and the costs are increasing. I don't really expect you to know what any of these graphs are. The reason I put this up here is to highlight that we would never know that this is what's going on with the beach unless we could work with geomorphologists who could give us that information on how to write those equations, what is going on with the beach. And they would have no clue what the value is, how much it costs and how much the benefits are from going and doing this to determine how often or what is an optimal time interval that we keep going on and putting sand onto the beach, if that is an optimal policy at all, right? And when we did this, coupling with the geomorphology and looking at incorporating these feedbacks, what we find is that our results are fairly accurate, or at least closer than what you would if you didn't. So what I have here is, this is what we observe in years, how frequently these beaches were nourishing their beaches, or these towns were nourishing their beaches, and this is what the model would predict as being optimal. And if this were a 45-degree line, the closer you are to this line, the closer your prediction is to what you actually observe. And we found that for a whole bunch of the beaches that we were looking at, the value, once we account for these feedbacks, is way closer to what you observe than if you did not account for these feedbacks. And so that was one kind of it shows that, one, empirically, these results support this idea that you need to be looking at these feedbacks to determine what the optimal policy should be. It also helps us try to identify what the impact is, like how big is the impact of sea level rise and growing costs of sand on different communities, right? So if you were to think of increasing erosion, which comes from more and more sea level rise, as erosion and costs increased by 100% or doubled, then your loss in property values, or the loss in the value of amenities, also increases, but it increases way more in a town that has is on average poorer, has lower value to begin with, than for a town that could have higher values. So there is this, climate change has an unequal impact on towns that are poorer, and they have a harder time adapting to climate change if you already start out with lower baseline value in your community, is what we found. I bet you're thinking, well, this is all okay, you're thinking about one community, they're doing all this stuff, but what is happening, but sand usually moves around and there's more towns along the coast, there's a lot of towns, and so what happens when one town does something is obviously going to affect what goes on in other communities. It isn't an isolated setting where you have economic decisions being made and nature is pushing back, and so there's this cyclical more and more erosion and more stabilization. You also have other towns, and so there's feedbacks that in this direction over time, there's also feedbacks in the alongshore direction. What one town does is going to eventually influence what happens in other towns along the coast. And we find this to be a diffusive process. If you put sand in one location, that's eventually going to spread out and affect the entire coast. So then I asked the question, should these towns be thinking about managing their beaches like this, or managing the entire coast? So are there gains from coordinating this whole process? Are there gains from thinking about what happens when one town does something, how is it going to affect what goes on in another community? And the answer to that is yes, as you would expect. There are definitely gains, and in fact, what we tried to see what happens when these towns act independently. What happens when there are these physical feedbacks, but they're not incorporating that. So say you have these 3 towns, and town 2 decided to go and add sand to its beach and just widened its beach. Now that is going to create this bump in the coastline, and that sand is eventually going to spread out and is going to then smooth out along the entire coastline. So what happens here? There's this increase in the gradient, there's this increased bump, which then is going to spread along the coast. So this town that does the nourishment faces more erosion, an increased erosion rate, because it's gone and put sand, it's going to erode faster. And these nearby towns face lower erosion. So this town's like, whoa, I'm facing much faster erosion, I'm seeing my beaches disappear, so they end up going and nourishing even more. Whereas the neighboring towns think, okay, my beach is not retreating so quickly, so they reduce the rate at which they're nourishing. And this process keeps continuing. You do more nourishment, then you face more erosion, so you're going to do more nourishment, and this town then becomes a sucker. Right? I'm the one that's going to keep paying to keep increasing the nourishment. So we have these suckers and free riders right by them, and this process continues. So we put this into a model with 100 towns, and this is exactly what you find. If you have decentralized management, it leads to the emergence or the emergence of suckers and free riders, towns that ended up nourishing 30, 40 times right next to towns that weren't doing any nourishment at all. And this also is not that different from what we actually observed. We have a town such as Carolina Beach, which has nourished 30 times in the past, I think 30 years or so, right next to another beach which has only nourished 6 times. So this is an empirical, there is, what we find in the model is in some sense what we're also seeing, and we're trying to explain this by understanding what the physical processes are. Right? So yes, there are gains from coordination, and however, there's no incentive for these towns to organize themselves to coordinate, because they always have an incentive to want to be the free rider and not the sucker. Right? And so there's always an incentive to keep waiting until someone else would do it, or once you're into that cycle, to keep going on and on and on doing that. So the question I'm looking at right now is that because there isn't an incentive to self-organize, are there solutions that can come through bargaining? Can we create a bargaining game, or is there a potential market for sand where these towns would be buying and selling sand permits in order to determine who gets to nourish and who doesn't? And even that is not as far-fetched as it sounds. I'm seeing a lot of like, what's going on? It's not that far-fetched after all. Miami Beach, several beaches have run out of sand, and they are in fact borrowing sand from their neighbors to try and keep their beach nourished so that they can keep up that tourism revenue, right? So the thought I want to leave you with, and it's open for, which would hopefully lead to discussion, is that humans are in fact geoengineering entire coastlines. Whether they're doing it intentionally or not is a different question. And what I'm interested in is there a way to move from this accidental geoengineering of an entire coastline to more intentional, optimally managed coastlines, so that we will have our beaches in the future. So that's what I have. Question?
We actually have about 10 minutes for questions.
So to rephrase, you're asking if Chris Christie knows about the economics of nourishing, because I wanted to ask you, who is currently managing this at any given state? Is it on the town level, county level, or what? Because you could play a game with the value of houses on a coastline by